All right, welcome everybody to this edition of the ICTA String Seminar. Today we are delighted to have Abhijit Gadde from TIFR Bombay, and he's going to talk to us about his recent work on modularity of supersymmetric partition functions. So Abhijit, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to give this virtual talk. So today, and before I start, let me also say that please feel free to interrupt and ask questions at any time you want to. Okay, so today I will be talking about a novel type of modular property that supersymmetric partition functions of higher dimensional theories enjoy. So by modular invariance, we usually have in mind the invariance that is enjoyed by the partition function of a two-dimensional conform field theory on a torus under the large diffeomorphism group of the torus, namely SL2Z. Now, this invariance is quite powerful. One of the most celebrated application of this invariance is the so-called Cardy formula, which expresses the density of operators at high energies in universal terms, in terms of the center charge. Now, apart from the Cardy formula, recently the modular invariance has been exploited through the program known as Modular Bootstrap to impose interesting bounds on gaps between states. So, for example, the gap between the vacuum and the first excited state. So this seems like a very useful tool that ends up constraining two-dimensional conform field theories quite a bit. Now, how about conform field theories in higher dimensions? How can we constrain them? Now, we know that higher dimensional conform field theories or conform field theories in any dimension obey constraints coming from unitarity and crossing symmetry. And we also know that they are quite powerful. The implications of those constraints, extracting the implications of those constraints is the program that is called the conformal bootstrap. But one can perhaps ask, are there any other constraints apart from the ones imposed by unitarity and crossing? Constraints perhaps akin to the modular invariance in two dimensions. Are we missing any of those? So, as I said earlier, the modular invariance is essentially invariance under the large diffeomorphism group of the manifold on which the partition function is defined. And in two-dimensional case, the manifold in question is the torus, and the large diffeomorphism group of it is SL2Z. Now it is an infinite dimensional group. It's an infinite group. So naturally, the invariances that come from it are quite strong, which end up constraining, with giving us these results as mentioned. So if you want to get very strong constraints on partition functions of higher dimensional theories, naturally you would want to consider them on manifolds which have big large diffeomorphism group, and invariance under such a group would give you constraints. Now, the natural choice for such manifold would be a D torus. It has a large diffeomorphism group, SLDZ, which is again infinite group, and it could perhaps give rise to very stringent constraints on partition functions defined on D torus. But unfortunately, constraining the partition functions on D torus is not something that we would like to do, because what we would ideally like to do is to obtain constraints on the operator spectrum of the theory. And as you all know, the state operator map is present only for the Hilbert space on SD-1. So ideally speaking, we would like to constrain the partition function on S1 times SD-1. Okay, so one can proceed in the same way. One can try to see what its large diffeomorphism group is and impose invariance under that. Now for D equals to 2, of course, we get back the torus and the whole story of the modular invariance that I briefly alluded to. For D equals to 3, this manifold is S1 times S2, and the large diffeomorphism group of this manifold is Z2 times Z2. The way to understand it is as follows. The first Z2 you can think of as a composition of antipodal map on S2 as well as S1. So antipodal map here, antipodal map here. So that gives you one. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. So before, you know, like you want to accept it is D-1. So what is the data that is, you know, like related to the partition function on the torus, on the D torus? Is there some, you know, like understanding of that? Like, is there some object? I mean, it's obviously something, right? I mean,
yeah, right. So I mean, the simplistic answer, of course, is that it's just enumerating states on a D-1 to, you know, on a quantization on a D-1 torus slices. But ideally, when, you know, another ambitious thing to say, which is untrue, is that perhaps it is counting the spectrum of defect operators, but that is not quite true as well. So besides saying these two things, I cannot say more about that.
So the partition function on D torus does not just depend on the operator spectrum, right? It also depends on somehow the, you know, 3-point functions or something. Is that?
Well, at least I don't know a direct connection between the conventional conformal data that is used to define the conform field theory, namely the operator spectrum and the 3-point function, and its relation to the partition function on D torus. I don't immediately have this type of a relation in mind. I don't know if this has been investigated.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so the first Z2 is the composition of the two antipodal maps. You need two antipodal maps because you want to preserve orientation. And the other Z2 is due to the non-simply connectedness of the diffeomorphism group of S2. Because it is non-simply connected, as you go around S1, you can make a loop in the diffeomorphism group of S2, thereby obtaining a non-trivial element of the large diffeomorphism group of this entire manifold. And this is because the diffeomorphism, the small diffeomorphism group of S2, it is known that it is homotopic to SO3, which is simply the isometries of S2. And SO3, as you know, its pi1 is Z2. So as you go around S1, you can make that loop, which if you make it twice, goes back to identity. And that is your other Z2 in this large diffeomorphism group. Now, of course, one can go ahead and study the implications of this invariance. But because it's a finite group, contains only 3 non-trivial elements, one would imagine that the implications are not very strong. Now, how about 4 dimensions? The manifold in question would then be S1 times S3. Although I have not quite found a definitive mathematical, you know, statement in the mathematical literature about the diffeomorphism group of this space, argument similar to the previous one would let you believe that the large diffeomorphism group in that case as well is Z2 times Z2. Now, these diffeomorphism groups of manifolds of such kind are very small, so therefore perhaps not so constraining. In higher dimensions, in fact, nothing is known about the diffeomorphism groups of this space, but it is perhaps safe to assume that they are quite small, in particular finite, because the infiniteness of SL2Z comes because you are allowed to exchange the two circles. But because these two factors in the direct product are on different footings, you are not allowed to do that. So I would imagine that the diffeomorphism group of higher dimensional spaces of the kind S1 times SD-1 are finite and small. So what does that mean then? Does this mean that you don't have...
Sorry to interrupt.
By the way, Loga, your voice is echoing. I don't know if it is just me or everyone.
No, probably it's my laptop. Is this better now? Or yeah, I don't. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So regarding the statement about D equal to 4. So in 4D, you know, like you can have like all these somewhat exotic diffeomorphism structures, right? I mean, like, you think that is there some relevance of that to, you know, like this kind of a discussion?
No, not that I know of. No.
I mean, in principle, you can think of conformity theory in, some exotic R4 or something like that.
Yeah, right, yeah. And, yeah, you could do that, but I think that is different from the question we are asking. Here we are just interested in the large diffeomorphism group.
And can I comment on that? I think, Loga, your point is that there are exotic differentiable structures in 4D, right?
Yes, yes.
But the whole point of diffeomorphism is that it's a symmetry within a given differentiable structure.
Yes, yes, indeed.
So maybe are you asking that if we have some other differentiable structure, then we might have some other diffeomorphism group?
Yes, you might have other diffeomorphism group, and there might also be some relation between partition function calculated with one differentiable structure and another differentiable structure.
Yeah, maybe.
It's not completely speculative.
Yeah, that's, as Abhijit said, that's definitely not. I guess he's talking of different diffeomorphisms for the normal differentiable structure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Because we are interested in the large diffeomorphisms. Yeah, I don't quite know how these exotic structures would fit in. Nothing is known of, it's not known whether there is a unique differential structure on S4. The differential structures for spheres start getting better understood in D equals 7, right? I mean, that was the first discovery that the 7-dimensional sphere has exotic structures. I don't know. Yeah, but more than that, I don't know the relation of those things with this discussion. Okay. Fine. So what does that mean then? Then does this mean that we don't have constraints akin to the constraints of modular invariance in 2 dimensions for higher dimensional theories? Well, not quite. And that is because of the following observation. There is a very special mathematical function called elliptic gamma function, and it enjoys a very funny property. Okay, it enjoys a property which is given here. When you interpret this gamma function physically, as I will say shortly how to do that, these tau and sigma variables are effectively 2 temperature variables. Okay, I will say why there are 2 temperature variables. So you can see that the gamma functions that are involved in this product are effectively, if one of them is at high temperature, the other 2 would be at low temperature, and so on. So it is a kind of a modular invariance in that sense. And unlike in 2 dimensions where you simply have invariance of the partition function under modular transformation, this is a more involved relation that gamma functions obey.
Sorry,
and here on the right hand side, this polynomial Q that appears is known as the third Bernoulli polynomial, is given explicitly over here. Okay. Yes, please.
Sorry, Abhijit, is the in this property in the third gamma function, the first argument should be Z over sigma, right?
Yes, thank you. That's a typo. Yeah, this should be Z. Okay. Now, it just so happens that this elliptic gamma function is the superconform index of a chiral multiplet of R chat 0 in 4 dimensions, meaning its partition function, supersymmetric partition function on S3 times S1. And mathematically speaking, this property can be thought of as a sort of a covariance under the group SL3Z. So there are immediate natural questions here. SL3Z is a large diffeomorphism group of 3 torus. So why is it that the partition function of on S3 times S1 is enjoying some sort of property under SL3Z? In particular, where is T3? So the rest of the talk will be effectively analysis and explanation of this, answering these questions. So before we do that, let us look at the modular invariance of 2-dimensional partition functions in a little more detail. It will help us develop some vocabulary which will be easy, and then with that vocabulary it would be easy to state the results in 4 dimensions. Now, because we want to focus on the case of supersymmetric theories, although I believe that potential generalizations to non-supersymmetric theories of these ideas is also possible, but in this talk I'm just going to stick to supersymmetric theories. In 2 dimensions also, let's just focus on supersymmetric theories and the supersymmetric partition functions. So supersymmetric partition function on a torus is known as the elliptic genus.
Abhijit, sorry, I just a mathematical question. This elliptic gamma function, mathematically, it is something very natural. I mean, you have of course given a property that it has, and probably you will say more about the function itself, but is this something that very naturally, I mean, I'm trying to just place it in some context. When you say, is it like on a torus or something, some periodic version of the gamma function or something like that? I mean,
Yeah. So from the gamma function, you can define what is called the Q gamma function. Okay, so that is the Q analog, and then there is one more lift that you can do of the Q gamma function, so called the elliptic lift, and hence the name elliptic gamma function. So usually you think of these hierarchies. You have the basic one. Well, the Q1 is actually called the basic one. So you have the ordinary one, the basic one, and then the elliptic one for hypergeometric functions and all functions, all special functions. And then somehow the elliptic gamma function is the elliptic analog of the gamma function, ordinary gamma function.
Okay, and this tau and sigma are, I mean, like the Q would have been some e to the 2 pi I tau or something if I...
Yeah. So in this case, we are going to have P and Q. E to the 2 pi I tau is Q, e to the 2 pi I sigma is P.
And in the limit, as those go to 1, you recover the usual gamma function or something.
Yeah. You need to do this more carefully, but yeah.
No, some taking the appropriate.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, another family that this elliptic gamma function belongs to is the family of the so-called multiple gamma functions. So this is, I think, a family in the transverse direction to the family that we just talked about. So let me not say what this family is in detail. Let me just mention some members. The 0th member of this family would be the Jacobi theta function. The first member is elliptic gamma function. The second member is the so-called double elliptic gamma function, and so on. And Jacobi theta function, you can think of it as the index of the 0,2 Fermi multiplet. The elliptic gamma function is the index of the 4-dimensional chiral multiplet, and the double elliptic gamma function can be thought of as the index of the 6-dimensional chiral multiplet. Of course, there is, the physical interpretation would not be available for higher multiple gamma functions, presumably because no superconformal symmetry exists there. But perhaps just with supersymmetry, one can give that meaning. I don't know, but this is just a side comment.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So as I said, let's just look at the modular property of supersymmetric partition functions in 2 dimensions. This partition function is known as the elliptic genus, as you know. So for concreteness, let's focus on 2,2 theories. Because we want the elliptic genus to enjoy the invariance under full SL2C modular group, we want to consider it in the Ramond sector. If you consider it in other sectors, in NSR or RNS, then you would have invariance under a finite index subgroup of SL2Z, but let's just focus on this particular definition of the elliptic genus. Now here, just to explain this real quickly, -1 to the f just imposes periodic boundary conditions along the temporal circle. E to the 2 pi I z j, you can think of it as background holonomy for the R symmetry gauge field, let's say in the left moving sector. And tau is the complex structure of the torus. It is coupled to the left moving dimension L0. Now, if you have global symmetries in the theory, then we can turn on holonomies for those as well. Let's call them xi variables. I have not written them explicitly, but you can turn on holonomies for those global symmetric variables. In that case, the partition function will be function not just of z and tau, but it will have those background holonomies for the global symmetry as well. Now, so far our discussion focused on the large diffeomorphism group, but we would like to treat the group of large gauge transformations on the same footing as well. So in this particular case, this group of large transformations, meaning large diffeomorphisms as well as large gauge transformations is the following: is SL2Z semi-direct product Z squared. Now SL2Z is the group of large diffeomorphisms, and Z square, which is generated by shift of Z by 1 and shift of Z by tau respectively, is the group of large gauge transformations. If you had more variables, then every variable will contribute a factor of Z square in this group. And it's a semi-direct product, not just a direct product, because SL2Z clearly acts on Z square, because Z square is a shift of 1. Z square is generated by one element, is one Z is shifted by 1 and the other Z is shifted by tau. So more explicitly, the action on the parameters Z and tau of this group G2D is given below. So G1, when it lives in the SL2Z, it acts on Z and tau like so, and when G2, which lives in Z square, it acts on Z and tau like so. Now the modular property of the partition function then can be succinctly expressed as follows: you have Z evaluated at these parameters Z and tau, and on the right hand side you have Z but evaluated on parameters related to the previous ones by G action, and these are equal but not quite. There could be a phase that is marking the failure of this equality. Now this phase is quite important because you cannot get rid of that phase. You cannot define a new partition function Z prime, which is Z times something, such that you can absorb all these phases away for all G. You cannot do that. So clearly this rings a bell. This indeed has to do with the anomaly of the theory, because anomalies are precisely quantities that you cannot get rid of by local counter terms. Now, just by virtue of this equation, these phases e to the I phi g, these phases, note that this phase has a subscript g. That's because this is the failure under a particular g invariance. If I use a g prime, then that may have a different phase, e to the I phi g prime, and so on. So this is a shorthand notation to encode modular properties under all group elements G. Now, just by virtue of this equation, the phases e to the I phi obey this condition here. So what this is telling us is that if you know the phase for G1 and if you know phase for G2, you can find the phase for G1 times G2. So in particular, in order to find phases for all the group elements, you only need to know the phases for the generators of this group G2D. And physically speaking, the way you would compute it is as follows. As I mentioned, this is related to anomaly. So indeed, you can compute this from anomaly form as follows. So you consider a torus with the parameters Z tau and another torus with parameters G inverse Z tau, and you can interpolate by filling in a 3-manifold in between these torus, in between these tori, and evaluate the classical Chern-Simons 3 form, anomaly 3 form on this three-dimensional manifold, with the boundary conditions being that you have this particular holonomy and the complex structure here, and this particular holonomy complex structure here. And this lets you compute e to the I phi g. And you can understand this equation as just a gluing of such two cylinders, because you have the first phase coming from this cylinder. You can construct the second phase by gluing this with another cylinder here, and the big cylinder itself will then give you this phase on the left.
Abhijit, sorry if I can interrupt. So the statement is that if I take the action of this configuration, am I supposed to calculate some classical action in Chern-Simons theory with these two boundaries?
Yeah, right.
No, I didn't understand. What is the configuration? I mean, what is the exact relation between this tube diagram and e to the I phi G1, G2?
Well, you just compute the three-dimensional Chern-Simons term in this background, which gives you e to the I phi g.
Okay, so I compute. So phi is the action of that Chern-Simons theory.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. So as I said here, as I said earlier, that because phi g is the anomaly of the theory, you cannot quite redefine it away. You cannot define a z prime such that all the phases are absorbed in the z prime. Because you only need to know this for generators of G2D, this can be specified completely by specifying their value on the generators. So it turns out that for 2,2 theories, the phases that you obtain can be taken to this form, where the phases for all generators are 0 except for 2. So phi s, which is the S transformation, is this one, and phi shift by tau, which I call the t tau, is this one. And a function that transforms in this way under modular transformation is known as the Jacobi form of weight 0 and index c over 6. Okay, so this is just a funny way of saying more familiar things, namely the property of the weak Jacobi form. Now, if instead you work with 0,2 theories, you would not have this particular variable z, which is related to the R symmetry. But if you had global symmetry, you could have those variables. And in those cases, a more general form of these phases is obtained. But at the end of the day, all these phases are computed, as I said, from the anomaly polynomial of the theory. So immediately you can ask this question: what is the space of functions that obey this equation, that transforms in a particular way? That the partition function computed for z tau and the computed partition function, let's say you're given the anomaly polynomials, which you're given all the anomalies of the theory, which enables you to compute e to the I phi g. So it enables you to compute the transformation formula for the elliptic genus. And then the question is, what is the space of solutions to this equation? Now, for 2,2 theories, this equation, of course, has been greatly studied in the case of elliptic genus. And the answer is known. You know the dimensionality of such a space, and you know how to parameterize such a space. This is concretely given in terms of what you could call a Rademacher formula, or the fairy tale expansion formula, where there is an explicit parameterization in terms of the so-called polar part of the elliptic genus. Now, I'm not seeing this anywhere, but one could, in principle, do a similar thing for 0,2 theory. If it is not done, it would be interesting to do. And then that would be a solution of a sort of a bootstrap program for 0,2 theories, because that's answering the question: if your 0,2 theory has this particular anomaly polynomial, or this particular set of anomalies, then what is the space of such theories? What is the space of elliptic genus genera that can give rise to such anomalies? So in this sense, modular property of the elliptic genus can be thought of as a bootstrap program. Okay, so let's go ahead and formalize these ideas a little bit more. So this slide here is going to be, introducing somewhat of a mathematical terminology, which we will use to state our results in Fourier. So the partition function, we will be calling it, so let's define the space of meromorphic functions of z and tau as n, and the space of phases by m. More accurately, what m is the space of nowhere vanishing holomorphic functions. Okay, saying phases is not quite a holomorphic notion, so that's why I'm the right way to say this is the space of nowhere vanishing holomorphic functions. The phases e to the I phi g, they belong to m, and the partition functions, because they can be multiplied by an arbitrary phase thanks to the local counter terms, you should think of them as belonging to space n mod m. Okay, so n mod m, because the mod m lets you multiply, turn on any local counter term. Then the equation obeyed by the phase that I said earlier on the earlier side is known as the first group co-cycle condition. Okay. Now, a trivial solution to this condition could have been that e to the I phi g is simply difference between these two, e to the I chi minus e to the chi evaluated G inverse. Now, if you just put it in, clearly things will cancel, and you will satisfy this identity. But if this were the case, then you could define Z prime is equal to e to the I chi times Z and absorb all the phases away. And because it is not possible, such a solution does not exist. Meaning e to the I phi g satisfies a co-cycle condition, but it is not simply a co-boundary. This makes e to the I phi g a non-trivial element of group cohomology. So if you think of e to the I phi g as some sort of a form, okay, just to make contact with a more familiar de Rham cohomology, if you think of e to the I phi g as a form, this is first of all a one form because it has one index g. A two form would be something that has two indices, g1 and g2. But we are dealing with one form. And this is a condition analogous to the form being closed. And this is a condition analogous to saying that it is not exact. So I will not go too much, I will not go more than this into the discussion of group cohomology. I will just say that e to the I phi g obeys this group co-cycle condition, but it's not co-boundary, and that's why it's an element of first group cohomology. So the notation here is that H1, this is the first part, G2D is the group in question, and M is the space in which this is taking values, also called the coefficient space. Okay. And there is a standard mathematical result which says that if you have such a short exact sequence, then saying that e to the I phi g is a non-trivial element of the first group cohomology is equivalent to saying that the partition function itself is a non-trivial element of the zeroth group cohomology valued in n mod n. Okay. So with this nomenclature, we can start talking about the results that we get in 4 dimensions, and then in the rest of the talk, I will explain why these results are true. Now in 4 dimensions, we are, for concreteness, considering 4-dimensional n equals 1 supersymmetric theories, which could perhaps have some global symmetry. Let's say the rank of such global symmetries are, and we turn on background holonomies for all of them. So it would be a function of those background holonomies, let's call them zi's, and also of variables which are geometric. Variables like the Q variable in the earlier discussion. So in 4-dimensional case, there are 2 such variables, tau and sigma. So you can think, so in 2-dimensional case, you can think of the tau variable as something that measured the twist of the spatial circle that went around the temporal circle. In 4 dimensions, it's not just a circle that is going around the temporal circle, but it's S3 that is going around the temporal circle. And S3, as you know, its isometric group is SO4. It has 2 Cartan generators. So you can turn on holonomies for each of those 2 Cartan generators. And roughly speaking, this tau and sigma are the temperatures associated to it. So it's not quite the temperature, but it's supersymmetric version of the temperature. Because you need to mix a little bit of R symmetry in order for make it into an index and not just a partition function. So all in all, the partition function on S3 times S1 would be a function of background global symmetry variables Zi and then the 2 variables tau and sigma. Collectively, I will just denote them as a vector tau. And the constraint, although we will end up getting a constraint on the index itself, it helps to, first of all, enhance the space of observables that we are talking about. So we will not talk about simply the partition function on S3 times S1, but we'll talk about a bunch of partition functions, where all the partition functions are labeled by a group element. That was not the case in 2 dimensions. In 2 dimensions, we always talked about one partition functions, namely partition function on the torus. But in 4 dimensions, we will talk about a set of partition functions, each labeled by a group element. So that would be Zg of tau. And we will find that Zg of tau obeys the first group co-cycle condition. That Zg1, G2 is expressed in terms of Zg1 and Zg2 like so. So this condition is precisely the same condition that was obeyed by the phases in 2 dimensions. But it is the partition function that obey this condition in 2 dimensions, but it's the partition function that obey this condition in 4 dimensions. Except not quite, it can fail by a phase factor. And the phase factor now has 2 indices because G1 and G2 are involved here in this equation. this failure phase factor has two indices, G1 and G2. And just by virtue of this equation, this e to the I phi G1 G2 obeys the second group Kosail condition, which is given here. And because you cannot redefine this away, this is a non-trivial element of second group cohomology. So it's not a co-boundary A, but it's actually an element of the cohomology. And equivalently, so you can say that e to the I phi G1 G2 is a non-trivial element of H2 G comma M, or equivalently, this ZG itself is the non-trivial element of H1 G in mod M. Okay. So in some sense, it's a one higher level analog of the two-dimensional story, where the partition function is obeying the first group Kosail condition. Now, of course, I will go into detail as to why my partition functions have this G label to begin with, and why are they obeying this sort of a condition. But the main result, what I mean by modular property of four-dimensional partition function is this equation, that the four-dimensional partition function obey the first group Kosail condition. Well, it's not quite obvious from this equation that there will be constraints, because modular equation, you would want constraints on the partition function. But this equation, as we will see, indeed will give us constraints just on the superconformal index. But this is stronger because it will relate not just the superconformal index, but other partition functions as well. We will see what their physical significance is. Well, one caveat to all this discussion is that the ZG are not quite the partition functions, but something that are very closely related, as we will see. Now, where is this modular property coming in? The modular property that I advertised, the modular property of the elliptic gamma function. Well, in SL3Z, there is this particular element Y, which cyclically permutes the three entries. So if you think of SL3Z as a 3x3 matrix acting on a three-dimensional vector space, there is a matrix which permutes these entries cyclically, and that has determinant 1, obeys Y cube equal to 1 clearly because it is a cyclic element. So if you evaluate the Kosail condition on this equation, you get this. Okay, zy, but with a shifted argument, again zy with a double shifted argument. And on the right hand side, so what the Kosail condition says, that it should be 1 modulo the phase. So you could complete this equation by introducing some phase factor here. So just from this equation, that the Y obeys, you conclude zy, whatever it is, obeys this particular condition with some p. Now, in the case of chiral multiplet, this zy is precisely the supersymmetric partition function on S3 times S1. That is the superconform index. Meaning zy is precisely the elliptic gamma function. So if you put it in, you recover the modular property that the elliptic gamma function enjoyed, with p being a specific polynomial q. So in fact, if you say that the p is essentially the anomaly polynomial of the theory, then in the case of chiral multiplet, it reduces precisely the third Bernoulli polynomial. So we conjecture in general that for any theory, this polynomial p is the anomaly polynomial of the theory. Okay, any questions? So you can see that this Kosail condition.
So you would be mainly working in 4D, right? I mean, or would you have something to say about 6D also? Like, does this generalize?
Yeah. I will say a few things about 6D as well, but I will focus mainly on 4D.
Okay.
Once the underlying geometric picture is clear, the generalizations are obvious to higher dimensions.
Okay. Okay, good. So now the second question I wanted to ask was that, so when you say that this P or Q in your next slide is an anomaly polynomial, okay, the question is that, what is it that you mean that the coefficients are the anomaly coefficients, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So I was not clear about that. So it's some sort of a cubic polynomial, and indeed the coefficients of that cubic polynomial are related to various types of anomalies in the theory.
But some of the structure of how the various taus appear and so on and so forth will also be related to some Chern-Simons action evaluated.
Yeah. So if you want to compute it honestly, you would do the computation analogous to the one that I mentioned in 2 dimensions. But there is a shortcut. The shortcut is to conjecture that it's the anomaly polynomial, and that conjecture works for a whole bunch of theories, including the free theory. And so that is what I do. That I conjecture it to be the anomaly polynomial, where by that I mean the polynomial whose coefficients are related to the anomalies in a very specific way.
Yeah. And just one more question and this thing. So this is about 4D. So you did 2D and 4D, where there are these continuous anomalies and so on. But what about things like 3D? Is there something there? There are discrete anomalies in 3D, like parity anomaly, for example.
Yeah.
And even in 4D, there are discrete anomalies like Witten anomaly, for example, which are not simply captured by some anomaly polynomial, but like, do they constrain some partition?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, well, at least in my considerations now, I'm not thinking of anomalies of discrete symmetries, but those would end up giving you more constraints probably. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So, as I was saying, the modular property, the most general modular property of the 4-dimensional partition function, you should think of it as this co-serial condition that the partition function obeys. Okay. Now you can ask the same type of question that was asked in 2 dimensions. The 2-dimensional question was, let's say I give you the anomaly polynomial. Let's say I give you all the anomalies of the theory. From there, you can construct these phases e to the I phi g, and then you ask, what is the z that transforms in this way under model transformation? That was the question that one asked in 2 dimensions. Here, now what is the z, or the space of z that obeys this condition? Now here also you could ask the same. Let's say you give me the anomaly of the theory. From there I could construct these e to the I phi g1 g2, and then ask what are all the z's that obey this equation. So in the same sense that the 2-dimensional modular property is a bootstrap program, you can think of this as also as a bootstrap program. Okay. So now let me get to the explanations of these results. So this modular property here, sorry, I didn't probably mention this, but the group in this case, where here I stated the result, the group in this case, when I say that this is the element of the group homology, the group in this case is actually SL3Z, which is the large diffeomorphism group of the 3 torus times Z cube. Okay, to the power r, because each of the global symmetry will contribute 1 factor of Z cube. So Z cube essentially is the shift of these variables Zi by 1 tau and sigma. Okay? And the SL3Z acts on the vector 1 projectively on the vector 1 sigma and tau. So because the SL3Z plays a crucial role, namely the modular group of the large diffeomorphism of the 3 torus, we will explain where this 3 torus lives. Okay, so you want to think of 4-dimensional geometry as being obtained by gluing 2 solid 3 tori.
Abhijit,
So,
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, in your previous slide, can you go? So is it true that any conformal n equal to 1 theory needs to have a continuous global symmetry or flavor symmetry? I don't think that is the case, but I'm also not sure if that's important for your setup.
No, it's not quite important. Yeah.
Okay, so then what is the 't Hooft anomaly if you don't have a flavor symmetry?
Well, you could have so
symmetry, yeah.
Well, okay, so maybe I counted the ANC anomaly
Okay,
is a part
so the
of
Euler
yeah.
and
Yeah, the Weil anomalies. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
In the supersymmetry case, it is related to the 't Hooft anomaly of the R symmetry. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
So I want to think of four-dimensional. So first of all, as I said, the partition function has a label G, and that's because this partition function is computed on a manifold that has a label G, and that manifold has a label G because it is coming from gluing the solid 3 tori, okay, in a particular way. Now, when you have solid 3 tori and you want to glue them to form a closed manifold, there are choices because you can glue the boundary of this, which is the T3, and the boundary of this. And in order to glue them, you have to specify the diffeomorphism element of this T3. And because the large diffeomorphism group is SL3Z, or more generally the group of large transformations, meaning large diffeomorphisms as well as large gauge transformations, SL3Z times Z cube, you have to specify a particular group element of this group G to make a closed geometry, including a bundle for the background global symmetry. Okay, so that's why this manifold that is, or manifold along with the background, the gauge bundle for the background flavor symmetry will be labeled by the element G of SL3Z times Z cubed to the power R. Okay, so in particular for S3 times S1, the gluing is as follows. So you can, first of all, let's forget about this S1. Okay, so let's just consider two solid tori. And we are familiar with how one could opt, this is more familiar than this S3 times S1, that to obtain S3 by gluing two solid 2 tori. So in order to do that, you have to glue the contractible cycle with the non-contractible cycle and vice versa. So in other words, you have to sandwich, or you have to glue this with an S element of the modular group of T2. Okay, which of course you can embed in the SL3Z modular group of 3 torus as well. So in this way you obtain S3 times S1. If you just sandwich an identity element, then you will obtain S2 times T2. And more generally, if you start sandwiching any group element G, then you will start obtaining more interesting spaces, in particular length spaces times S1. Yeah.
Abhijit, but then you're not using the full SL3Z, right?
Because not all the 3 circles are getting mixed, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can always find a basis in which one of the circle goes for the ride. So, I mean, I've not looked at all the elements of SL3Z, but it seems that you always produce S1 times length spaces. Length spaces because you can always embed, you can always find an SL2Z where you can embed this group element. Because some actions are going to be trivial because of this contractible cycle.
So you're saying the group elements that you will take will be always sitting inside some SL2Z subgroup of the SL3Z. That's what you...
No, I will not restrict him like so, but it will always happen that you can do that.
But in general, 2 T3s, you might have more general these things, right? I mean,
yeah. Yeah, you could, I think, a priori, but yeah. Yeah, I've not thought too deeply about this. I mean, I also would have thought that, you would get more spaces, but the explicit elements that I looked at, you could always find an SL2Z where they sit. One should also take into account that that one of the cycle is contractible. So some action of some of the elements on that geometry is going to be trivial because of this contractible cycle.
Sure. Yeah. But
So and that's what lets you always embed this in one of the SL2C.
right.
But yeah, I guess you could do more general things. I'm not sure. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question to think about. Right? Okay. So yeah, so a priori you could use any group element G, and the manifold that you obtain, I'm calling it MG, and the partition function on it is ZG. Okay. Now the the labels, which are Zi, tau, and sigma, you can also associate them on one of the geometries, one half of the geometries. So it is best, in order to understand what those are, it is best to restrict ourselves to rectangular tori. So 1 sigma tau are essentially the lengths of this circle, and this circle respectively. Okay. And I should also say that in order to preserve supersymmetry on all these manifolds obtained by gluing, you require the R charges to be even integers. Yeah.
Sorry, what you just said, the rectangular tori is a statement that sigma and tau are real. Is that the same?
Yeah. That's why I was able to say the length. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Thanks.
Right. Well, I guess, yeah. Okay. So to preserve supersymmetry on all such manifolds, the R charges are required to be even integers. This is something that Seiberg and collaborators have shown, that if the R charges are even integers, then you can preserve supersymmetry on all the length spaces times S1. So this is the R symmetry that we'll be working with that. So in other words, you would need a n=1 theory so that there is an R symmetry, the choice of R symmetry, such that all the operators have integer R charges, even integer R charges. So the partition function on the manifold MG can be thought of as an inner product of the wave function that you obtain by path integrating on this side and from the path integrating on this side. So you have a wave function built on this T3 and this T3. So let's say bra here and ket here, and then you take in a product.
Sorry, Abhijit, can you just ask? So when you say R charges should be even integers, this is the R charge which enters the superconformal algebra, the thing with the 3/2 R.
No. So these R charges will not. Yeah, some other choice of R symmetry. There is a choice of R symmetry such that all the operators have integer R charge. This need not to match the conformal R charge. The superconformal
right. R charge. So which is the R charge which will always things like delta equal to 3/2 R.
Yeah.
That kind of things. Yeah. Okay. So you just want some U1 symmetry, which under which the supercharges are charged. Which kind of under which all the operators have even integer charges. Is that
right?
Okay.
Yeah. So as I said, the partition function ZG can be thought of as an inner product of the bra and a ket. So the partition, I'm given. So I've written the partition function as inner product like so. Note that I have kept the parameters on the left side to be tau and the right side to be G inverse tau. This is different. This is G inverse tau because in order to glue them, you need to act with a group element G. And because after the gluing they need to fit together, you need to use a torus with parameters G inverse tau on the right hand side. So that's why ZG is this particular inner product. Okay. Now the Hilbert space. So clearly, this means that the next thing would be to insert a complete set of states here. So the natural question is, what is the Hilbert space on T3? Now the Hilbert space on T3 is infinite dimensional in general, but in this construction, what we are doing is we are performing a partial topological twist. Yeah.
Sorry, just to understand. So this ket is the object that you compute by doing the path integral on a solid torus. Solid T3?
Yeah.
That is why you get a ket because it's it has a boundary and so. Okay. Thanks.
So as I was saying, the Hilbert space of the theory on T3 in general, it's infinite dimensional. But in this construction, what we are doing is we are doing a partial topological twist. So by that, I mean the spin connection of this disk here, the solid T3 geometry, you can think of it as S1 times a disk. And the spin connection of this disk here, you have turned on a background R symmetry so as to cancel the spin connection. This is known as the partial topological twist. What it lets us do, it lets you make the theory topological on the disk. So whatever wave function you obtain, it's independent of the geometry of this disk. So in particular, you can stretch this disk all the way and make it infinitely long. And if you do so, you can think of this wave function as something that is obtained after an infinite radial time evolution. Okay, and that's why you get projected onto the ground states. So effectively, the Hilbert space on T3 for supersymmetry case where you can perform this partial topological twist is finite dimensional. And because it's finite dimensional, it will be very convenient to work with it. So
sorry,
previously I made a comment that for non-supersymmetric cases also these ideas are generalizable. So this is the main obstacle that you might face, that the Hilbert space on T3 in the non-supersymmetric case will not quite be effectively finite dimensional, but you would have to work with all the infinitely many states that could propagate on T3. Yeah.
Sorry. So I just wanted to understand, when you say ground states, so these are ground states on S3 cross S1, S3 cross R, or what is the?
No, these are ground states on T3. These are ground states on T3, because I'm thinking of this as a radial time evolution. Because I'm taking this disk, shrinking it very far, making it into a long cigar. Okay, so now the cigar, effectively you can think of it as an R plus times T3, right? So you have T3 evolution for a long time. So the Hilbert space in question is always on the T3.
So I take the whatever my conformal field theory is, and put it on T3, and I ask what are the ground states. And okay, because the compact space.
And also I should also say that these parameters that we turned on, the background holonomies, in this case they give you mass parameters for the three-dimensional theory.
Okay.
So these are simply massive. So the effectively the question is, what are the ground states of a massive theory on T3?
Right. So this is a statement about some generic point for G or in the tau sigma, or you could imagine that there's some degenerations in tau sigma where.
No. So deforming this cylinder here, this cigar here doesn't touch tau sigma. The tau sigma are dimensions of the boundary, the T3.
Okay.
They are not related to the geometry of the cigar.
So I'm just trying to understand what goes into the statement that the number of ground states is finite. What are the assumptions that you're making in saying that?
Okay. Okay. Maybe. Yeah, I'm not saying that for all theories this should be true, but for gauge theories this is certainly true, because you simply compute, you write down the effective action for a massive theory on T3 and look at its minima. Okay, and there are finitely many minima. This computation closely resembles the computations that were done by Nekrasov and Shapashvili sometime. They have worked a lot on this kind of thing.
But are there special, fugacities where these mass gaps close, or they're kind of massive, so they're gapped everywhere? So is there some interesting?
Let's see. Yeah. No, well, the partition functions could have a meromorphic structure. So this can blow up also. So there could be some interesting points here in this space of parameters where this partition function blows up. That is certainly possible.
Okay.
But we are always thinking of it as a meromorphic function.
Okay. So the statement is that for generic Z, from generic fugacity, there is actually a gap. And hence you're in like compact space with the gap and so on and so forth. So then you just have like a finite dimensional constants. Is that the argument?
Right. I mean, for the theories that I know, for all the gauge theories, you can show that this is true. But there are, now that we are thinking about supersymmetric theories, there are so-called non-Lagrangian theories also. And for those theories, I don't have much understanding of even the space of ground states.
Okay. And do we know, is there a simple way of computing what is the dimension of ground states? Of let's say, if I given a theory.
Yeah. So there is one practical way and one more physical way. So the physical way is basically, as I said, you write down the superpotential and compute the minima of the superpotential of the massive theory. Okay, and these are essentially the so-called Higgs branch vacua. What you obtain are the Higgs branch vacua of the theory.
Higgs branch. Okay.
Okay. And another practical way is basically you write down the standard holonomy integral to compute the index. So as you know, the index can be written as integral over gauge holonomy, right? And then that holonomy integral, instead of doing it numerically or whatever, you compute it by summing over poles. Okay, and then those residues arrange themselves into finitely many, infinitely long families. And each of those families then correspond to those vacua that I'm talking about.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So, because you want to capture all the information about this effectively finite dimensional Hilbert space, instead of computing just this one variable, namely the partition function, it is better to compute what you would call partition function matrix. It's a matrix of partition functions where instead of having vacuum on this side, you insert defects. So you insert a surface defect which lives at a point here at the core of the cigar and wraps these two circles, and you insert another surface defect which lives here at the point at the core of the cigar and wraps these two S1s. So I'm calling them I and J, and you can consider the partition function Zij, and that will then capture information about all the effective, all the states in the effective Hilbert space. And because if it is n-dimensional, you only need to consider n defects, because generically they will end up spanning that effective Hilbert space. Now, that's not what we will do. We will choose a different basis vectors to compute this matrix in. So what we will do is that we will choose these Higgs branch vacua that I talked about. So I'm not going to describe what those are in detail, but those are, you can think of them simply as some set of states that are orthonormal to each other on T3. Okay, so let's call those states alpha. So we define the states alpha tau as a projection of this vacuum state tau onto alpha. It's given here. Okay, so in this basis, now if you compute the partition function matrix in this basis, it will be diagonal. That's because the alpha will only click with alpha ket. So this Z alpha beta is proportional to delta alpha beta. The wave function, which is the coefficient of this projection, is known as the holomorphic block. Okay, so in the Higgs branch vacuum. And once you have this observable, it is very easy to see. So this matrix here, as I said, only has diagonal entries. So we will just focus on the diagonal entries, and it's easy to see why those diagonal entries satisfy the cocycle condition. Because as we said, the Z alpha alpha, the diagonal entry, let's consider this for G1 times G2, and this is this particular inner product. Now we insert a complete set of states like so. And we normalize this because these states are not necessarily orthonormal, and we get this expression. Okay, and in order to make contact with this Kosail condition, we define a new variable which we call the normalized partition function, which is the ratio of Zg and Z1, but evaluated at G inverse tau. So when you take this ratio, this is just to take into account this normalization here, you get a nice and symmetric looking equation that is obeyed by this normalized partition function. And this is precisely the Kosail condition. So when I said on the previous slide that the caveat was that the Z that I mentioned is not quite the partition function, it is these things that I was talking about. It is not partition function in two ways. One is that it's an element of this matrix, okay, meaning it's a partition function evaluated in a particular Higgs branch vacuum, and the actual index is going to be sum over all those things. Moreover, it is not quite the physical partition function. It is normalized in this way. You have divided this by a partition function on S2 times G2. Okay, and also one thing to note is that in this derivation we have not produced the phase factor. So what is going on? Well, this is because we assume that the states are defined uniquely by specifying the parameters. Okay, but that need not be true, because as you move in the parameter space, if the Berry connection is non-trivial, then if you make a loop in the parameter space and come back to the same parameter, the wave function that you get may not be the same. It may be multiplied by some phase. In fact, this particular operation here, where we are going to the parameters related to tau by G1, G2 action in two ways. One, first directly going to this G1 times G2 tau, and the other way is to go to G1 first and then from there to this element G1 times G2. It carves out a triangle in the parameter space. Okay, and e to the I phi G1 G2 is precisely the phase associated with this path. So as a result, we get this equation, which is exactly the Kosail condition that I had flashed in the slide where I mentioned the results. Okay, so this, as I said, is the main result. Any questions? Okay, so I guess I'm overshooting quite a bit.
Yeah, sorry. Are there like examples where, apart from where the phi is non-trivial, where you take some interacting theory and you can compute these things explicitly?
Phis?
Yeah.
Yeah, the phis, as I said, are simply polynomials with whose coefficients are anomalies.
Right.
In a particular way.
So you're saying they will generically be non-zero?
Yeah.
Okay. But can I see this in a particular n equal to 1 superconformal theory? Maybe you see, or?
Yeah, so we will see an example. We will see the simplest example would be that of a chiral multiplet, let's say, a free chiral multiplet. Mm-hmm. Okay. So just to make connection with the holomorphic blocks, as I said, the holomorphic blocks are these wave functions, the projection of the ground state on the alpha vacuum. Let's call this the holomorphic block BL, and then this projection, let's call this right holomorphic block BR. And then the normalized partition function is the ratio of the two blocks, like so. Now, if this were true, then Zg will be trivial in cohomology, because this is simply written as a co-boundary. Okay, and that's why we did not get a phase in the earlier derivation as well. So that means this formula cannot quite be true for all G's. And in fact, we will see that that is indeed true, that the partition function is not always expressible in this way. Okay, so now we want to get a little concrete and give explicit expressions for these wave functions and for these partition functions. So before we do that, let's look at this group a little more closely, SN3Z. So I will think of SL3Z as a 3 by 3 matrix acting projectively on 1 sigma and tau. Sigma, remember, is the radius of this contractible circle. Now, generally, SLDZ in mathematical literature is taken to be generated by these matrices Tij, where you have identity and 1 at the ij entry. So in this way, you can define these matrices Tij, and there is a way to write down a bunch of relations that these guys obey, and thereby generating this group SLDZ in general. But because in this context, it's convenient to remember different SL2Zs, we will choose a different set of generators. We will label Sij to be the S matrix in the Ij subspace. So in the Ij subspace, there is an SL2Z group acting on the Ij subspace, and the S matrix, the standard S matrix for that SL2Z group, we'll call it Sij. And similarly, Tij would be the T matrix in that Ij subspace. So then you can show that SL3Z is generated by S23, meaning the swap of this guy and this guy, S13, meaning the swap of this and this guy, and then T23, which is sigma going to sigma plus tau, this kind of thing. Now to generate this additional factor of Z cube, we also append this list of generators by one of the shift symmetries, because once we have one of them, then with the action of SL3Z, we can generate the others. So all in all, the generators of SL3Z times Z cube symmetric product are S23, S13, T23, and T3, small t3. Now, this is also an important observation, that the SL3Z has a very special subgroup in it. And that subgroup is the following. That is the subgroup of all the large transformations of T3 that can be extended into the bulk, that is over the entire solid T3. Okay, so note that if you consider a simple transformation, let's say large gauge transformation along this circle. Now that clearly is a large gauge transformation even of this full geometry, even of this solid T3. But if you consider large gauge transformation along this circle, it is a large gauge transformation of this T3, but it is not a large gauge transformation of the full solid T3. That's because if you have introduced a large gauge transformation here, in order to complete this bundle, you would have to introduce some flux through sigma. Okay, so that means this large gauge transformation cannot be extended all the way to sigma, all the way inside the T3 in this contractible cycle. And all the large transformations which can be extended do indeed form a group, and it's a subgroup of SL3Z times Z cube to the power R Z cube squared, or Z cube. And moreover, because they can be extended completely into the bulk, the wave functions are simply invariant under those, because it's just like in the case of T2 in 2 dimensions, where you do the large transformation and you expect that the partition function is simply invariant under it. Here also it's the same story, that there is a wave function instead of partition function, but the transformation that you're talking about is the symmetry of this entire half geometry. So the wave function should be invariant. It could have a phase, but up to that, modulo that phase, modulo m, this partition function is simply invariant under this special subgroup. So this makes the normalized partition function for all those all the elements of that subgroup equal to 1. And this subgroup is SL2Z times Z squared. So this SL2Z is generated by S13 and T13, which is the SL2Z acting on this subspace. Now that clearly is true because it doesn't even touch this this contractible cycle. And the small T1 and T3 is also easy to understand, that just shift of Z by 1 and tau. As I said earlier, if you take shift of Z by sigma, then that introduces some flux through here. So that is not allowed. And then there are other T's, which are actually shifts of sigma by 1 and tau as well. Okay, so what we know is that Z hat for all these guys is 1. For all these guys and all the elements that are generated by these guys is 1. Okay, so here we saw that the entire SL3 is generated by these guys, which is S23, S13, T23, and T3. And in this list, except for this term here, all these are elements of H. Okay, so in the beginning I had said that because of the group Kosail condition, you need to know what this Z hat is only for generators, meaning only for these 4 elements. And moreover, we saw that 3 among those, the Z hat for those is simply 1. That means you only need to know Z hat for 1 element, ZS23. So that ends up being the only undetermined variable, which is Z hat of S23. Okay, so this is for the normalized partition function. Remember that the normalized partition function was obtained from physical partition function by dividing it by Z1. So in order to get to the physical partition functions, we also need Z1, not hat, but just Z1, which is the partition function on S2 times G2. So the result of this discussion is that there is only unique normalized partition function that is being constrained by all this discussion, and that is Z hat S23. Happily, it is the index. Happily, it is also the normalized partition function associated with index, because S23 is essentially gluing these this circle goes here and this circle goes here, giving you S1 times S3. So it is even though we were talking about family of partition functions, there is only one guy which is not fixed, and the constraints that we will obtain will only be on this one guy. And then in order to make contact with the physical partition function, we also need to know Z1. Okay, now we are ready to do some more concrete discussion. So for the chiral multiplet of R charge 0, you have Z1. So this is something that you can compute by localization. This is the partition function S2 times S1. So I should say that for chiral multiplet of R charge 0, the effective Hilbert space that I was talking about, the finite dimensional Hilbert space, is simply one dimensional. So that's why the alpha index is absent. There is only one type of partition function that one is talking about. And Z1 is 1 over theta. This is the Q theta function. And ZS23, which is the index, is just the elliptic gamma function. Okay. And from these two expressions, we can find Z hat, right? Because Z hat is simply the ratio of this guy and this guy with slightly shifted, with a S23 inverse acting on these arguments. So once you have this Z hat of S23, you know that the Z hat of other generators is simply 1. And from there, you can combine them in any which way you like, thereby obtaining partition functions over all MGs, which includes the length spaces. And because you're also allowing for background for large gauge transformations, those will include length spaces along with any type of background flavor flux that the manifold may admit. So in one shot, you are able to compute all the observables on all these geometries just from this Kosail condition. Moreover, you can get constraints on these as well, as follows. The normalized partition function S23, it turns out that instead of S23, you can simply discuss Z hat Y. I talked about this Y element, which was the cyclic permutation. So you can just swap your undetermined variable from Z hat S23 to Z hat Y. I pick Y because it's a more symmetric group element. And that, as I discussed earlier, obeys Y cube equal to 1. And once you evaluate the Kosail condition for that, you end up getting constraints on Z hat Y. This should have a hat. Okay. And indeed, in one of the more mathematical papers, Felder and Warchenko have shown that the elliptic gamma function is a non-trivial element of H1 G n model. Okay.
So, sorry, Abhijit. So this Y corresponds to some very specific length space.
Now Y is also S3 times S1.
Okay.
But it could have different parameters.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So, so for this particular theory, which is the simplest theory, you can also compute the so-called holomorphic block, and it is this gamma function here. And if we use this formula for the z hat, which I said is not quite true, because it does not take into account this Berry phase, and compute z hat of h. H, remember, is the element of the special subgroup, which is expected to be 1. And you compute this for all these elements which are generators of h, and you find that they don't quite give you 1. So this is one indication that the holomorphic block gluing formula will not be valid as it is for all the group elements. So what this formula is giving us is not quite. So as I said, if this formula were valid for all h, this would have been a global trivialization of something that is cohomologically non-trivial. But because this is valid only for some h, this is just simply a local trivialization. This is giving a local trivialization of this non-trivial form. Okay, so let me quickly discuss gauge theories. So for gauge theories, also you can compute these indices, and they are now in that case you have multiple vacua. So that's the sum over alpha, and each diagonal entry can be thought of as a product of the perturbative part times a product times a partition function, which is localized at the core of the cigar, also known as the vortex partition function. Okay, and you can show that this perturbative part is equivalent to z hat y in cohomology. Okay, so all the cohomological equations that this z hat y obeys, this perturbative part also obeys. So explicitly written, this perturbative part obeys this identity that z hat y obeyed, which is given here. Now, in this case, if you promote this p to be, if you conjecture this p to be the anomaly polynomial, meaning a particular polynomial with coefficients being anomaly coefficients, anomalies, then this exactly this z hat, this perturbative part precisely satisfies those constraints. And this is easy to check because this perturbative part, it turns out for gauge theories, this is simply product of elliptic gamma functions. So because you know how the elliptic gamma functions transform, you also know how this perturbative part transforms for all gauge theories. And you can check that indeed what you get on the right hand side is that particular polynomial. Okay. Now, of course, another natural thing that one could do with this, once you have modular property, when the natural question is how does it relate high temperature to low temperature? In 2 dimensions, we have a Cardy formula that answers this question. Is there an analog in 4 dimensions? Now, of course, when I say Cardy formula here, I mean a supersymmetric Cardy formula. We're not quite talking about thermal partition functions, but just indices. So this perturbative part of the gauge theories, as I said, obeys this condition, and this p, as I said, is a particular 't Hooft anomaly polynomial, and we can take the high temperature limit here of the first term by taking sigma and tau, which are kind of temperatures, to 0, which are kind of 1 over temperatures to 0, and in this limit, you can show that these 2 factors here in this equation, they go to 1. It's not immediately obvious because it's not as obvious as it was in 2 dimensions, because in 2 dimensions, the temperature for the other term simply went to 0. But here, because you are taking this limit, one of the temperature goes to the constant value and the other goes to 0, and the same thing happens here. But nevertheless, you can show that these 2 both go to 1. Now, this would be the statement for the perturbative part, that the high temperature limit equals this, but it's not quite the full partition function, because as I said, it also has this vortex part. But because this vortex part is localized in 2 dimensions, which is where the vortex lives, you can show that it's subleading in the high temperature limit. So as a result, the high temperature limit is totally governed by this polynomial p. So at leading order, you can recover the results that were recently obtained by Kim and collaborators and Kabobuz and collaborators which state that the high temperature limit of the superconformal index in this, by high temperature limit, in particular, I mean this particular limit here, is given by this. Now here I have moved to the superconformal R symmetry. So far I was not in the superconformal R symmetry. I was working with a R symmetry which was integral. You know, all the operators had integral charges with respect to the R symmetry that I was working with. But you can shift it because the superconformal R symmetry is essentially this integral R symmetry plus some flavor symmetries, if you know, some U1 flavor symmetries if there exist any. And with that shift, you can show that the coefficient, the leading order coefficient that governs this high temperature behavior is 3c minus 2a over 9, which precisely matches the answer that these guys are given. But because this is a modular property and not simply something that will tell you only the high energy limit, one would expect that you should be able to do something more. In fact, one should be able to do something akin to the Rademacher expansion. And that would be amazing. So that would give a lot of information about the theory. If one can, so what I envision is that using this modular property, one should be able to write down the entire index just in terms of the so-called polar pieces. Okay, and that would really be striking, I think. But that is still, I think, some distance to go. I mean, what I said just now can be thought of as a generalization of this Cardy formula. Okay, so what is the geometry that underlies all this construction? You can think of it as follows. In 2 dimensions, the partition function we considered was on T2, but instead of T2, let me think of it as a T2 fibration over a point. Okay, so I'm just going to indicate this instead of drawing the manifold, I will just draw the base. So this is a T2 fibered over a point. It is equal to the partition function on a T2 fibered over a point, but with different parameters. But not quite, because you can have a phase which is computed by anomaly Chern-Simons 3 form on this particular manifold, where instead of a point, you have an interval where you have 1 going to G, and that gives you how the T2 is fibered over this interval. And on this, if you evaluate the Chern-Simons 3 form, you get this phase. So you can think of the zeroth group cohomology condition that is satisfied with the partition function in 2 dimensions as this pictorial equation here. In 4 dimensions, we talked about not partition functions based on a point, but partition functions that were on manifolds that you could think of as T3 fibrations on an interval. Okay, so because I want to draw just base space, this is the T3 fibration, and this is the manifold, because this is the base space, and you should think of as a T3 being fibered over it. Okay, and these labels are telling you what is happening to the complex structures or the not quite complex structure, but this parameter is 1 sigma and tau of the torus. So you can think of this fibration here in 2 steps. You can break it up. Instead of going from 1 to G1, G2, you can go from 1 to G1 first, and then from G1 to G1, G2. Okay, and then these should be the same. Well, not quite, because this particular space has this as the boundary, right? This triangle, 1 goes to G1, G2, and then coming back. And this is the phase that I was talking about, the Berry phase. Okay, and this manifold here, what I mean by that is a disk and a T3 is fibered over it. So this is telling you precisely what sort of phi manifold you should consider in order to compute this. So you consider the phi manifold given to you by this group cohomology picture, meaning this is the base here, and a T3 is fibered on this base in a particular way, labeled by these G's. And on this phi manifold, you compute the Chern-Simons phi form, giving you this phase here. Now, this immediately suggests a generalization statement for 6 dimensions. In 6 dimension, you consider the partition function not on a fiber on an interval, but rather fibered on a disk or a triangle, like so. So this describes, and instead of, because it's 6 dimension, I want to look at T4 fibered over a disk, like so. And because it's T4, the group in question that will appear is SL4 times z to the 4 power I. And you can think of this vibration and split it into three parts in this way. And in each part, you can get again z hat, but with different labels. So I have written all the z hats appear, all the z hats that appear here in this picture explicitly below. So these two should be equal. Well, not quite, because there is a 7 manifold whose boundary is this. Okay, so 7 manifold is thought of as this tetrahedron with a T4 vibration. This exactly tells you what is the 7 manifold that you should use to compute the Chern-Simons 7 form to get you this failure phases. And interestingly, the index of the chiral multiplet in 6 dimension, which I briefly mentioned it to be the double elliptic arm function, indeed enjoys a modular property that follows from this group cohomology. Okay, so now I'm at my last slide. Sorry for going so over time. So let me quickly go through this and then I'll finish the talk. So as I said, what I do, as I said, the constraint here, the phase that appears, I conjecture it to be a phase that is closely related to the 't Hooft anomaly polynomial. But I also said how it's explicitly computed from a 5-dimensional Chern-Simons theory point of view. It would be nice to actually do this computation honestly and reconstruct these phases. So that's one thing that one could do. And another thing is that the constraints that we obtained were directly stated on this so-called normalized partition function, which is not quite, ideally we would like to state these conditions in physical partition function, not quite normalized partition function. So it would be nice to rephrase all these results as being constraints on the physical partition functions. And once we have those, then we can go ahead and analyze other implications that could follow from it. The thing about this Rademacher type expansion that I was talking about. And another thing that I briefly said is that these gluing constructions clearly goes through even for non-supersymmetric theories. The only thing is that one would have to deal with infinite dimensional nature of the Hilbert space that lives on T3. But even in free theory, it would be nice to carry out this program. So instead of, you pick a particular state on T3 and look at the partition function in that sector. In some sense, it's some sort of a block, kind of like a conformal block. So you think of conformal block is something where a particular operator is propagating in the middle. So similarly, you think of the partition function. Well, not quite the partition function, but only that part which has, a particular state propagating in the middle, and that block should obey all these interesting properties that are outlined here. In supersymmetric case, one could identify what that block was, because that had a very physical interpretation as a Higgs branch partition function. But in the non-supersymmetric case, it is not quite clear. I suspect the simplest thing would be to first consider the ground state propagating, and then look at this ground state block and investigate its properties. I think it would be nice to do this even for free theories. Another thing to say is that just from this geometric pictures that I was drawing towards the end, you could consider more, different things that other than what I just said. For example, you could consider, so in 4 dimensions, I consider T3 vibrations over an interval, but in 6 dimensions, I consider T4 vibrations over a disk. But in 4 dimensions also, you could consider T2 vibrations over a disk. Or in 5 dimensions, or in 6 dimensions, you can consider T5 vibrations and interval and so on. Now, just for going through these going through these pictures, immediate generalizations, immediate conjectures for what these would be is that the partition functions associated to the first case should be an element of the second group cohomology of SL2Z times Z square to the power R, valued in n mod m. And in the case of this T5 vibrations on an interval, it should be the first group cohomology of SL5Z, semi-direct product Z5 to the power R, valued in n mod. So it would be nice to investigate even these other things in detail. Yeah, sorry for going over time again, and thank you.
Thank you, Abhijit. That was a really nice talk. Maybe we can all unmute ourselves and clap for Abhijit. and we can move to further questions.
Sorry, Abhijit, could I ask a very naive question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, initially you started by saying that in conformal field theory, you would like the manifold to be S3 cross S1 because you have this radial evolution on S3. But later you had to consider all the length spaces which are related to S3 by this modular transformation. So you actually need the partition function of all these classes of 3 manifolds, or is it enough to just restrict to S3 cross S1?
Yeah, so the main result was that these partition functions obey this first group cohomology condition, this first group cosine condition, right? So in order to state this, I require all the partition functions, because this is just telling us that how the partition functions on different manifolds are related to each other. Okay, so in particular, once you know them for generators, you can compute them for all the other ones. Okay, but I also discussed how using this you can get constraints on the index itself, because it turned out to be kind of a happy accident that the SL3Z, first of all, thanks to that equation, I only need to discuss generators of SL3 and generators of this group, and the generators of SL3Z were these 4 elements: the S23, S13, T23, and T3. And after this, I pointed out that 3 among these 4 are elements of this special subgroup. And the subgroup is so special that I can immediately conclude that the partition function, this normalized partition function, is 1 for these. So this guy, this guy, this guy, the normalized partition function turned out to be 1. So at the end of the day, the only undetermined or only normalized partition function that I didn't know anything about was simply the one associated to S23. And that is the index. So at the end of the day, the constraints ended up purely on S23.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, Abhijit, can I ask one more question?
Yeah, please.
So you had this normalized partition function, which is really, if I understand correctly, it is a ratio of the partition function on S3 divided by S3 plus S1 divided by S2 cross T2 or something. Is that right? Yeah.
Sorry, the fire alarm is going off here for some reason. But I think it's because of some malfunction and not because of fire. So let's just continue.
Sorry. So I was just asking. So the S3 cross S1. Sorry. There is a Hilbert space interpretation that's indexed over the Hilbert space, right?
Yeah.
But is there such a Hilbert space interpretation for this ratio, for what you call as a normalized partition function?
No,
Like,
no. I think it's a very artificial thing. It doesn't have any natural physical interpretation. That's why ideally it would be nice to rephrase all these discussions as constraints on just Z and not Z hat. So yeah, it's a good question, but I don't think there is any physical interpretation in Z hat. Hello, was I audible?
yeah, kind of. Thanks. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. When I closed my ears, I think I also ended up covering the microphone. So I was saying that
fine,
the Z hat, the Z hat is. I don't think it has any physical interpretation.
Like I was wondering whether you kind of remove some particular states out, and then and only count the other states and compute the index over them. Some more restricted index.
No.
Okay. Thanks.
But I should say that once you have these constraining equations for Z hat, and you supplement this with, let's say, Z1, then you can constrain all the Zs as well. But so that means there is one, yet another input to this program that you have to give, which is Z1. Okay. But that is kind of fine because Z1 is S2, partition function S2 times T2. Okay. And that obeys its own invariances, because you can think of this as kind of an elliptic genus associated just with the T2 factor. So it has all the properties that an elliptic genus would have, this Z1 guy that you have to input. So you can supplement these two things and end up getting constraints on Z. So I want, yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions for Abhijit? Okay. Yes, if there are no more questions, then let's thank Abhijit again. And thanks a lot for giving us this talk. And we can conclude now. And we have one more talk on Friday for everybody that's still around. Okay. Bye, Abhijit.